This presentation introduces the matter of property development finance. Property development is a very attractive form of property investment because it offers high profit and high risk for a short-term property engagement. While property development is far more active than property investment per se, because the developer is actively engaged in transforming property from one land use to another. It has significant advantages in that it does offer to bring the advantages of property to a high profit outcome for somebody full-time involved in managing property. To do property development effectively, one needs to be quite competent in the construction and planning areas as well as in pure property economics. To understand property development, we have to understand the fundamentals of property development income. The property developer aims to capitalize the increasing usefulness of land property, largely through the increased residential population density, say by turning cottage land into home units or apartments, and also increased commercial and industrial density, say by the replacement of small shops by office blocks and multi-use high-rise property. Ultimately, property development has to do with the multiplication of land utility, and we'll be looking at the way that the property developer is actually earning most of the income because of the changed underlying land values of the property which is under development. We can contrast the property developer to the builder. A builder is the person responsible for actually transforming the undeveloped property into the developed space. But the builder does not achieve the kind of margins that the developer does because the builder does not take control of the land. As a result, the builder's role is considerably less risky, but it is also less profitable. To understand the opportunities for development, we have to look at the way that property value grows over time. It must be remembered that land appreciates while improvements depreciate. Ultimately, land value is based on future rents, and so all sale prices are based on the rental value of the future. This means that while the developer is only interested in a 2 or 3 year time frame, that is the time that it takes to get the development built, ultimately that end realization, the sale of the developed space, attracts the prices that it does as a result of the rental value of that space off into the future. And for this reason, the developer must have an understanding of the long-term viability of the market in which he is operating. Future rents grow due to a number of factors. Primarily, increasing population is the major guide for increasing rents. Secondly, improving infrastructure is also critical. Thirdly, improving overall economic vitality is important for increasing rents. The increase in rents are ultimately grounded on the amount of the tenant's income that is available for real estate. This means that for the household, it's that part of the household income that is available to service housing expenses. This can also be thought of as a residue, in that the household can be thought of as having a particular income. From that income there are fixed expenses due for things like utilities, food, and other living expenses. And ultimately, whatever is left over, once living expenses for the general accepted standard of living are deducted from the household income, the remainder is available for either saving or real estate. Invariably in Australia, it goes all into real estate. Likewise, businesses are faced with pretty much the same ultimate equation. That is, of their revenues. Once expenses and profit expectations are deducted, the residue is available to pay for rent. And so in this way, a shopkeeper can calculate how much rent they're willing to pay based on the revenue that they're likely to get from operating their business at that particular site, and deducting their costs, including the business owner's own income and profit needs. In this way, commercial tenants or industrial tenants also end up paying rent as a residue after the fixed costs of business, that is, the costs necessary to make the business operate at a normal level, are deducted. Once rents are seen as a residue, it becomes obvious that as the community's overall economic vitality increases, business incomes and household incomes are both likely to increase, and therefore the amount available to fund real estate rents will also increase. In addition to this, as communities grow, the highest and best use of land tends to change. This is the result largely of the expansion around the perimeter of an urban area, but also the rezoning of more inner areas to more productive land uses, such as the conversion of land around the middle of a town into commercial use, and that commercial zoning being rezoned into more intensive use. A small and stagnant community does not need to have its land assets rezoned or more intensively used. This is something that only comes as the community grows and its economic strength increases. This is important because the developer needs to also be aware of how different communities are faring in terms of their economic growth. And so ripe development land is always best suited where the developer can identify that growth is taking place. It's useful to maintain an awareness of the causality, however. It is the growth of the community, not merely a planning change or whatever, or a developer's decision to build such and such, that actually causes the site to be ripe for development. This fact is often obscured by the slow passage of time and the way the developers tend to observe opportunities because the community has improved in some way or expanded. The source of development opportunities is highlighted once planning is considered. As communities strengthen, highest use changes. But this means that the planning restrictions that were appropriate, or the planning permissions that were appropriate for the smaller community, while they may have been appropriate and realised highest and best use for that smaller community, once the community grows sufficiently, those same planning settings or restrictions tend to limit the old use as suboptimal. And this means that the developer will see that there is a new and higher best use for the property than currently is permitted. The developer tends to perceive the existing planning restrictions as being the limit on the opportunity for using land. However, this isn't strictly the case. While the current zoning may in fact keep the old land uses, it is not the result of the planner's decisions, but rather fundamentally the opportunities that exist as a result of the community that actually give the developer the opportunity. However, rezoning tends to release land for the new highest use, and it is often the developer that manages this rezoning process, or perhaps not the rezoning process, but at least the actual development approval. And that is the approval to take an existing parcel of land and practically turn it from an old use into a new use through some form of construction or civil works. And so the development approval process that the developer manages is a key part of the whole development process, because what it does do is release this new and more intensive land use for actual realization that was only nascently or implicitly created by the growth of the community. One way or another, once the development is approved, that means that the highest use means higher rents, and so the developer aims to realise those higher rents in terms of the sale price for the developed space once it comes online. Because the developer has to do with the introduction of higher land uses that are currently common, the developer's work has much to do with forecasting and estimating the future direction of land use for a community. And for this reason, the developer's work is highly speculative. It's important to be aware that one of the key aspects of why the developer's role is so profitable is because the developer isn't actually developing the land for the developer's own use, but rather with a speculative intent that there will be others who will want the developed space for this higher and better use. The fact that there is a considerable investment in conforming the property to this higher and more expensive land use means that the developer is taking quite a risk in doing the conversion. For this reason, the developer expects a higher level of profit than is common in other aspects of property. It's worth reflecting on exactly what level of profitability is appropriate for various types of development, because although there are industry norms in terms of the expected development margins and internal rates of return applicable to development, a more nuanced approach is to look at the actual risks in terms of the level of speculation involved in particular developments, because in some cases the risks involved are mitigated because of the circumstances of development. This is especially the case where you're developing with certainty as to the eventual owner and user of the developed space. Lastly, it's important to be aware that while community growth leads to a higher possible use, the highest and best use of property can also fall when a community or a population contracts. We are seeing this in many regional areas, especially those where local employment opportunities are failing because of changes in regional industry, especially with the demise of the agricultural sector. Development profitability, therefore, is based on the control of land as land use changes. There are basically three steps in this change of land use value. The first is where the community strengthens, and perhaps when there is a general rezoning of land. This is really only leading to an implicit increase in land value, because even though the community has grown and perhaps the zoning has changed, the new land use has not been realised, and perhaps land has not necessarily changed hands. However, if it were to change hands, we could expect some increase in land values to happen at this first step. The second step is when planning approval is achieved. This is where the developer usually approaches whatever instrument of government is responsible for planning approval and actually is given permission to develop to a particular design, either for a subdivision or a building construction. At the point where development approval is achieved, the developer can be certain of being able to construct a particular form of improvement on the property. And so once development approval is obtained, the land value jumps up because the increased land use has actually been released for use. There is a certainty that the new land use is available, even though construction hasn't occurred. The third step is the actual construction. The construction phase can only proceed once planning approval is obtained. There are a number of risks and costs involved in the construction phase, and also there is the sale risk at the end of the construction phase. And so while the construction phase realises the increase in land value, it is not without its risks. These three steps each are steps along the way as the land changes in its value from its old highest and best use to its new highest and best use. And at the conclusion of the construction phase, there is new space, whether it is subdivided land available for construction or completely developed space suitable for occupation. It's at that point that the new land use actually is realised in terms of rents or sale price. Normally the developer aims to capture at least the second and third of these. Larger developers often aim to do what's known as land banking, which consists of buying the land very early in the process before the community is aware, generally, or the original landowners are aware of the uplift in value that is potentially coming as a result of community growth. However, many developers don't do this and simply buy the land close to the time when development is ripe to happen. Also, some people operating in the development industry are content to separate the incomes from items 2 and 3. And so there are some property economists who specialise in buying land that is ripe for development, obtaining planning approval, and then selling the land on with the development approval in place, but without having completed the construction. For these operators, the advantage is that this strategy requires relatively less costs, considerably less risks, and yet still able to realise a profit based on the changing land value due to the certainty of having development approval. When this happens, the developer who comes in to actually do the construction takes on the sales risk and the construction risks, and so would expect to earn a developer's profit. However, it's constrained by the advantage of having the development approval already obtained, and so they have to pay a higher price for their land than would otherwise be applicable. And so in this way you can get developers taking either all 3 of the land value improvements, or only 2 and 3, which is quite common, or even just one of either the second or the third step. In undertaking this, however, the important thing for the developer is that their opportunity in the market is because, for one reason or another, the end user is not in a position of being able to construct the new land use themselves. This is especially apparent in the case of high-density residential development. While it's possible for a person to buy land that they intend to, say, put a house on, so to buy a house lot and put a house on it, however, no one can buy a piece of space and put an apartment on it that isn't a part of a large block. And so the individual end user, the owner of the eventual apartment, normally does not have the capacity to build the entire block, and for this reason they need to rely upon the developer. And it is this reliance that gives the developer the opportunity to be able to operate between the 2 land uses the way they do. To some extent, the increased complexity of the property development and development approval process that has happened over the last generation or so is largely responsible for the large increase in the development industry, because Before that time, it was considerably easier for the end users, the end owners of land, to be able to make available for themselves the land that they need. And so there was considerably less speculative opportunity for the developer operating on the kind of scales that are common today. While it's one thing to be aware of the 3 steps in the increase of land value between the old land use and the new, the distribution of that land gain is not quite so straightforward. One way or another, the allocation has to be between the difference in the land value under the developed land in contrast with the old land use and its old land value. The ripe development land, that is, land which is in a situation suitable for development, may have this potential higher value. But how is it actually distributed between the landowner and the developer? This is resolved by understanding that land value is always a residual. In this way, the developer receives only sufficient income from the development process to reach his target of profitability. And so once the developer's expected rate of profit is understood, then this plus the construction costs are deducted from the expected sale of the developed space, what is known as the realisation, and the remainder is left for the original landowner who receives it as a capital gain. And so the starting landowner, once the land is recognised to be ripe for development, receives the residual benefit, that is the benefit less the developer's profit.
This is illustrated in what is called the developer equation. On this equation, it's quite clearly seen in the form laid out in the slide that the residual land value is what is left over once construction costs, finance costs and development profit are subtracted from the end sale revenue. Because construction costs, finance costs and development profit are all knowable and to a certain extent fixed by the competitive market, especially for labour and return for finance, it can be said that the deductions that are in the middle of the developer's equation are fixed for a particular economic circumstance. And this means the 2 variables are, first of all, the expected end sale revenue, which is an estimate of how the community will value the land in the future at the point that the developed space comes online, and the residual land value. It's important to see that the independent variable is the end sale revenue, what in the development industry is referred to as the realisation. Realisation is what is estimated by both the developer when considering the feasibility of a development, but also the landowner or his consultants in working out what land price to set on the land which is ripe for development. In this way, the first transaction of a development, which is taking control of the land, either by acquisition or some other option or whatever, sets in place the anticipated return for the developer based on the estimate of the end sale revenue. This means that the calculation of the end sale revenue, or the forecasting of it, is absolutely critical. And largely it is the misestimation of the end sale value which either makes development very profitable or very dangerous. We can also see in the developer equation that land is always valued as a residual that leaves wages and profits levelled. In this particular case, the wages are levelled because the construction costs are set by competitive tender, and because of that, the return to the construction businesses that are involved tends to be normalised. That is, it's only just high enough to pay their obligations at a normal level of profit. Likewise, finance costs and developer profit relate to the anticipated minima that an owner of finance, an investor, or the developer are willing to accept. It's a very important factor to know what developer profits are likely to be. You'll find that most textbooks talk about 25% as the developer's expectation, but this can be a bit deceptive. First of all, there is the problem with the timing. In earlier and simpler times, before DCF methods were commonly available, developers worked on what was referred to as a margin. This was simply the excess of income over the total costs. While this is effectively an indicator of profit, the developer margin is only a rate of profit when the development takes exactly 1 year to complete. Typically, a land subdivision development will take somewhere around 18 months to 2 years, and many other developments tend to work at least this kind of time frame. Larger and more complex developments tend to take anything up to 3 to 5 years. And of course, stage developments are even more long-term. This means that the development margin is an oversimplistic profit measure in a complex environment, leading to the necessity to move from the development margin to an internal rate of return. Generally, it seems to be the case that developers take IRRs somewhere between 16 and 35%. 16% tends to be in lean times for smaller developments. 35% tends to be for larger high-rise developments, and usually they're achievable in the better parts of the property cycle. One of the curiosities of the developer equation is that it means that a rate of profit is built into the developer's expectations. The land value should be set in such a way as to guarantee the developer's expected rate of profit after all costs are taken into account, given a sober estimate of the end sale revenue. This means that, at least notionally, development should be a very low-risk activity. By and large, it tends to be low risk for most parts of the property cycle. The only time when development becomes problematic is when, during a property boom, land values are set on the expectation of an escalated end sale revenue, which is over-optimistic. And especially once those end sale expectations are set in the mind of the landowner, they tend to set land values so far above what is soberly realisable in actual development that the developer, if they engage in the development, will most probably fail. We can summarise the effective operation of the developer equation and the residual land value as the RLV is the land price used for ripe development land that transmits the net value uplift from the hire use to the landowner, leaving only the developer with a normal profit, even though the tendency in the industry is to leave the developer with a fairly comfortable IRR. However, the setting of the RLV concentrates the estimation risk, that is the estimation of the end sale value, all onto the developer, because once the landowner has sold the property, they effectively are realising that uplift value and leaving the actualisation of that uplift value on the developer's head. And so this means that the developer tends to take the estimation risk, the risk that the estimate of the future value is in fact not correct or perhaps optimistic. One point to note all through this is that unlike most other property investments, financing costs are included in the whole calculation of the developer equation and the RLV. This is because it's recognised that from the developer's point of view, they're operating as a business and as a financial investment rather than as a simple property investment. And so financing, especially since it is such a universal part of the industry, is taken into account, because obviously the developer also must take it into account in estimating their overall profitability. This tendency of the RLV to capture today, for the landowner, tomorrow's value uplift brings out some interesting peculiarities in economic theory. Generally, what tends to happen is that once it is perceived in the marketplace that land values have risen as a result of optimism about future price expectations, the prices tend to be what's referred to in economics as sticky. By this is referred the tendency of prices not to move slickly following the rational expectations of the market, but rather to stay stuck with an expectation which is possibly overambitious. It's because the owners get used to the idea that their land is worth such and such, and this becomes their concept of value. The distribution of profit, therefore, is split between the landowner and the developer. Where land values are rising faster than the landowners believe, then the developers win. Where land is appreciating slower than the landowners believe, then there is opportunity for the developers to make a profit. We can see this over the period roughly from about 1992 up to more or less the present, where from the early 90s to about the mid-2000s, about 2004-2005, there was a strong expectation of continued capital growth in land. This was a real phenomena, and it did mean that both developers and landowners were making considerable profits, because generally values were rising faster than almost anyone believed. And so not only were the landowners making record capital gains, but also the developers found that during the period of development, the escalation in end land values meant that by the time the development was ready for sale, land values had moved so far forwards that they also made supernormal profits. However, from about 2005 onwards, the reverse has happened. By the mid-2000s, we had a situation where there was an extraordinarily high expectation of land values and the value of developed space. And as a result of that, when that effective bubble was moderated, and that doesn't mean necessarily a collapse of land values, but simply the levelling of the trajectory of land values, then the prices in the market were still set with the expectation of ongoing strong capital gains. And for this reason, these sticky prices for undeveloped land meant that landowners were expecting prices that could only be supported if the land market was continuing to rise in the way it had, say, around 2000. And for this reason, it has become impractical in many cases for developers to be able to develop profitably, because in order to buy the land with these still unsustainably high land values that were set by expectations that were appropriate, say, between 1995 and 2005, today these land values simply mean that there is no profit left for developers, just a huge amount of risk. We are now in a position to summarise the risks associated with development. The first thing we notice is that because the development profit is set as a part of the fundamental pricing mechanism for the land, one way or another, the development industry should be as secure as property. This is largely because the profit is built into the computation of land cost. Hence, it is secure as the estimates of cost and demand. However, because that estimate of future demand can be influenced by the historical trends which don't necessarily follow a sober and rational estimate of where demand is going, this can be thrown into uncertainty. However, with that aside, through most parts of the property cycle, Property development is fundamentally secure, and we tend to see this through most parts of the property cycle, and developers do tend to operate quite profitably. It is only during the correction and post-correction stage where land tends to be overpriced as a result of the sticky pricing left over from the optimistic period before, largely due to the psychology of landowners. Development risk tends to be realised only during property downturns or that doldrum period after a climax. But for the rest of the period, property development is fundamentally secure. However, the risk of development tends to be increased or leveraged as a result of the use of debt finance. Because of the reliance on debt and the fact that interest rolls up over time, this means that the developer is very dependent on the timing of the sales, and so the risks increase once the timing of events tends to blow out. And so if construction takes too long, or if sales are sluggish, then even though the prices may come in according to expectations, it can severely erode the profits. What this means is that the developer is vulnerable to demand fluctuations, which are going to affect price and timing of the end realisation, but is also subject to the finance risk, that is, the impacts of changes in interest rates during the period of the development. And since development is taken over a period at least of a couple of years or so, then what this means is that changes in interest rates over a period of, say, 24 months is going to have quite an effect on the profitability of the developer. Oddly, this use of debt finance means that the developer accepts the risks that the bank has shedded, even though the actual realisation of risk that accrues to the developer is precisely the result of the price of the profit that is taken out by the banking system. This is illustrated in this diagram of the way that leveraged profitability behaves over time. What we can see is that the amount of profit which is made in a development is relatively modest compared to costs. However, once debt finance is used, what this means is that the equity becomes a very small part of the overall capitalisation of the development, which means that profit can become a very large percentage of equity. This means that fundamentally debt finance magnifies the rate of profit quite considerably. However, this magnification is moderated by the cost of interest. We can see that the longer it takes to realise the revenue from the development, the lower the profit rate, because of the eroding effect of the interest cost. For this reason, the developer must very carefully consider the timing of the development in computing the feasibility. Generally, a feasibility will be considered reasonable if, at the expected point of realisation, the amount of profit left in the job after the payment of interest costs is sufficient to provide a reasonable return to equity. But what we can see is that if the timing of the sales is set longer as a result of delays in construction or professional services or council approval or whatever, the cost of loan interest is all the time eroding the profitability, and so the overall rate of profit falls over time. This means that if the development isn't concluded during the time frame expected by the developer, the rate of profit will fall quite significantly and is very much a function of time. If demand for developed space falls between the point where the developer commits to do the development and when the space is actually ready for sale, what this can mean is that the developer may be left sitting on developed space and not be able to find a purchaser for the price that the developer has computed is necessary to be able to clear their stock and realise a profit. If this continues for any length of time, it can get to a point where the cost of interest rises to absorb all of the profit. This is what's known as the break-even point, where interest equals the profit from the development, leaving the developer only with the equity that they started with at the beginning of the process. Unfortunately, even by this point, there is no guarantee that the development will be sold down, and so the rate of profit can go negative into a loss situation, which means that the developer is likely to come away from the development with even less than their equity contribution in the first place. Significantly, this fall in profitability to the developer does not affect the supplier of debt. From the lender's point of view, even though the developer's profit might have fallen to zero or in fact gone negative, there is no threat, at least at this point, to the lender being able to recoup all of the loan principal and interest without loss. And so for this reason, even past the developer's break-even point, the bank actually perceives no risk at all. However, in the example that we're pursuing here, once the interest cost gets to the point where it absorbs not only the profit, but all of the developer's equity as well, then the bank's risk begins. This is where the bank is not able to recoup from the development all of the loan principal plus all of the amassed interest. It's important to identify these 3 points in time. First of all, the expected time frame that was used by the developer in setting the initial feasibility. Second, the break-even point, at which point they make no real profit, but only break even and leave with the deposit or equity contribution that they started with. And the third point, which is where the bank actually starts to experience a loss, or at least a loss of interest. However, even at this point, where the bank considers that the development has become a cost, it should be noted that the loss to the bank does not mean that they have necessarily lost their loan principal or a major share of their interest. It merely means that their net total interest rate tends to reduce from this point because they are losing the extra interest which they would otherwise earn. The effect of increases in bank interest rates are illustrated by taking this slide a little further. As interest rates increase, what this means is that the timing of the break-even point and the point at which the bank starts to experience actual risk all move a lot earlier. However, the increase in interest rates not only affects the cost to the developer, but it also affects those purchasing the developed space. And this means that both the expected realization revenue will fall, but also it is likely that the sales period will increase. And this means that there is a double effect on the developer. Both their internal costs are increasing over time, making the development even more dependent on time for profitability. But as well as that, the likely revenue from sale and the timing of sales are both going to move adversely to the developer. This means that the developer is extremely exposed to changes in interest rates. While it can be seen that the developer is very sensitive to interest rates, we can now move to the way in which development debt financing is organised. The basic financing is through regular mortgage, and this is a loan from a bank secured by the basic land itself. The interest rate and availability of the mortgage is very much a function of the location of the development, the market, the developer, the property, the economic cycle, and the ability of the developer to be able to convince the bank that the development is feasible both in itself and within the capacity of the developer. All of these factors will influence, first of all, the availability of the debt, but also the risk premium that the bank is likely to apply to the loan because of the particular circumstance. For this reason, development financing is considerably negotiable, and it does come down ultimately to the ability of the developer. The levels of leverage are comparable to the basic mortgage finance available for other forms of property investment. And the norms, which are often used, at least for capital cities, are that typically a mortgage will be available to about 80% of the prime cost. That is the cost of the land and also those costs which are sunk in terms of construction. Sometimes the loan is set in terms of a percentage, usually the same, but on what is referred to as hard costs. And this means that costs such as professional fees and other services are excluded in calculating the leverage amounts. A second leverage limit, which is often used, is the ratio of the amount borrowed in terms of the end value. This is often around 60%, and it reflects the fact that the end value of the development will be considerably higher than the sum of the initial costs. Usually, this leverage value is used as a secondary test of acceptable leverage amounts rather than a simple alternative. The basic security for development finance is the property itself, like any other property loan. It must be kept in mind that the basics of development really consist simply of buying and selling land during which construction takes place. And so this means that the mortgage that's available will be conformed first of all to the basic value of the underdeveloped land, which may have some kind of improvements on it. The value of the land increases as development approval is attained, and in some cases developers refinance after DA because in this way they're able to increase their borrowing limit. Next, as construction progresses, borrowing can be done against the value of the partly constructed development. However, this needs to be taken very carefully because a partially finished building is actually considerably less valuable than the finished building, or even the absolute proportion of the finished building that it represents. This is because if the developer were to collapse, trying to sell a half-finished property and get another builder to come in and complete it introduces a number of very practical problems in the building industry. In some cases, early in the construction phase, the improvements on the property may even be the result of causing a negative impact on the overall value of the land. You can consider this in the case where an old house is pulled down to be replaced with a set of home units. The house is able to obtain some kind of a rental income. Once the house is demolished, the overall value of the property diminishes somewhat. But then, when the new development is commenced, until there's a significant part of the new development put in place, if the property were to be sold, a new builder would need to be found, and that builder would not be aware of the specific issues to do with the construction as it existed, perhaps weaknesses or problems with the quality of what was already constructed. And there are a number of problems in handing on the plans and so on from one builder to another. For these reasons, a partially constructed building, in realistic terms, is valued considerably less than the land plus the value of the construction to date. The bank needs more than simply security on the property, where the property represents a partially constructed development, where the value is ultimately gained by an estimate of what's happening into the future. And so for this reason, often banks will expect some proof of sales or pre-commitments for leases, representing a definite recognition of the end sale value of the development. And so for this reason, banks, especially in periods where the market is unsettled or perhaps near the top of the property cycle, will insist on pre-sales or pre-commitments. Pre-sales refer to contracts for sale of the final product, even though construction has not concluded and in some cases has not even commenced. Pre-commitments refer to lease obligations where you have a tenant who has guaranteed that they will take up a certain amount of space. The amount of pre-sales and pre-commitments is an indicator to the bank of the realism in the estimated end values, and it also reduces the overall risks because changes in value and likelihood of the market to sell on time are both reduced when pre-sales and pre-commitments are present. In some cases, especially when banks are particularly cautious, the expectation for levels of pre-sales or pre-commitments can reach as high as the value of the loan. And so this means that a bank would say, we will lend you so much money on condition that there is that much value in pre-sales already negotiated. From the point of view of the banks, this does not entirely remove their risks, because even though a contract might be underway for a pre-sale or a future lease, that does not guarantee that the sale will absolutely go ahead, because the purchaser at the pre-sale point will usually only have a part of the sale price put down as a deposit. And so if the end buyer defaults, the bank can still be left with only deposits instead of the complete coverage of the sale value. A third type of security is what's known as a tripartite contract. Tripartite contracts are where the bank insists on being close to the actual contracts for things like the construction and also in some complex developments for contracts relating to other interested parties, often local government or perhaps adjoining owners, where the development involves some special interaction between the development and the surrounding land. A tripartite contract is where the developer and the bank both sign the contract with the third party. In this way, the bank injects itself actively into the management of the development and is able to take a stronger position in managing the risks. A fourth form of security are by way of bonds and other sureties. This is a situation where the developer will undertake to place as security other assets outside of the development to secure the loan. There are quite a variety of ways that this may take, but the important commonality is that they all represent ways of providing the banks with security which is above and beyond the development itself. When taking development finance, while it may appear fairly straightforward, the pricing of the loans can be quite complex. In particular, as well as the basic loading of a premium on the interest rate. Developers should watch for miscellaneous fees. These can consist of line fees and other add-ons which will vary quite considerably from one lender to another. While basic development finance is available for up to about 80% of the cost of development, in optimistic times developers often want to increase their leverage further. This is done through what's referred to as structured debt or other forms of access to debt finance. It can also include equity finance that we'll deal with separately. The simple form of additional debt is by way of a second mortgage. The disadvantage of a second mortgage is that because the lender of the second mortgage will only be paid after the first mortgage has been completely paid out, including interest, the second lender is in a considerably more risky position, and as a result they tend to expect a considerably higher rate of interest. and this becomes very expensive, in fact prohibitively expensive for developers. A variation of second mortgage is what has come to be known as mezzanine finance. In Australia, mezzanine finance is only found in connection with development, though in the United States it has been also used for investment in other parts of the property market, including industrial. Mezzanine finance consists of a second mortgage, but with the addition of a profit share being given to the lender. This means that the lender takes partly a debt position, and for which they would expect a higher interest rate. But in addition, the profit share means that the lender has the opportunity to share, almost like equity, in the additional profit if the development is successful. In an optimistic market, this can be quite an attraction to entrepreneurial lenders, and it tends to attract the more commercially oriented banks. Mezzanine finance came into Australia over the last 20 years or so, and was particularly important over the last 10. Using mezzanine finance, developers can achieve virtually 100% finance, and in fact, in the most optimistic phase of the early 2000s, developers were able to actually borrow in excess of 100% financing on the basis of confidence in the end value of the property and the strength of the developer's overall performance and business position. Overall, the mezzanine finance has the advantage that it tends to share risk. Although it increases leverage and therefore increases the finance risk, because the profit share represents a quasi-equity part of capitalisation going to the lender, it tends to mitigate that increased risk somewhat. However, mezzanine debt, of course, is still quite risky, and because it is increasing the overall leverage, it tends to represent an increase in risk over simply using a single mortgage, what is known as senior debt. The pricing of mezzanine finance is quite complex, and in fact, because it represents both an interest rate and a profit share, it's virtually impossible to compute what the appropriate pricing is. Instead, mezzanine finance tends to be priced simply by market norms, and so this means the negotiations between the developer and the finance supplier tends to be set not by some financial calculus, but rather what the various parties end up being comfortable with. Lastly, the attractiveness of mezzanine finance varies quite considerably with the economic and property cycle. When the cycle is going through an optimistic growth phase, mezzanine finance becomes quite sought after by developers, and there are a number of lenders willing to participate in the high levels of profitability found in the development industry, and so they're not just willing but rather keen to be involved on some of the upside. However, once it becomes apparent that the development industry is no longer profitable, especially in situations where the sticky prices means that development becomes very difficult to achieve profitability, the availability and prudence of using mezzanine debt becomes quite different. And so we see that the use of mezzanine finance in more sober parts of the property cycle is somewhat more restrained. The third form of advanced financing is equity financing. Equity is simply obtaining capital through the inclusion of other equity partners who are willing to put ownership funds where they participate equally in both the risks and the returns of the development. These are often in the form of joint ventures with other parties. Principally, these can be either the landowners or the end users, or pure equity investors. Equity investors are distinguished by an interest in achieving higher returns for higher risks than debt financiers. The advantages of equity financing to parties that have a natural interest in the development, especially landowners, is that already you have an interest in the development because of the ownership position. Joint ventures with end users also offer an interesting opportunity for developers. The advantage of operating a development with equity financing from end users is that the eventual sales risk tends to be minimised, because if the equity partners are already a party to the development, the transfer price for the end value of the development can be set at the beginning. And so in this way, equity financing can actually reduce the level of risk to the developer. It's all a matter of looking at the co-party and also their position. The disadvantage with equity financing, which makes it unpopular in highly profitable times, is that the developer loses the leverage benefits that accrue to debt financing. And while this is a disadvantage, it has to be recognised that it also limits the leverage exposures to risk that come doubly through debt financing. Equity financing tends to be more popular at parts of the property cycle when property is more depressed and there is less optimism about strong capital growth into the long term. This is the case that has existed as a result of the GFC from about the mid-2000s onwards. We will now draw together some of the specifics of development finance. First of all, because income in the development project only comes at the end as the development is sold down, interest is traditionally not paid through the development period, but it is rolled into the overall land, and so the interest is added to the principal period by period, usually computed on a monthly basis. This is referred to as the capitalisation of interest, and so it is not paid as accrued, but rather rolls up over time. This requires a particular approach to modelling, which will go a little bit beyond what we can do in this course. The notion of capitalised interest is an important concept, though, when dealing with development property. Secondly, refinancing is common after development approval. This is because of the value uplift to the land. This is particularly the case where the developer buys the land early and land banks, because the valuation of the land can be quite uncertain until DA is approved. The advantage of refinancing after development approval is that it maximises the amount of senior debt that can be obtained for the development. Senior debt, of course, is the cheaper form of debt, and so the more that the developer can obtain, the overall greater is the leverage advantage. Thirdly, debt is drawn down progressively to maximise the leverage. This means that while the developer may be willing to contribute a certain amount of equity, that does not mean that the equity is all contributed when the land is initially purchased. Rather, as the land is purchased, the developer will only inject into the development the minimum amount of equity to meet the leverage requirements set by the bank. When refinancing happens after DA, there can be further adjustment to the amount of debt which is drawn back. Likewise, through the construction period, debt can be drawn down in proportion to the overall amount of construction, again running in tandem with the increase in equity. Overall, the later that equity is contributed to the project, the greater the overall leverage benefit, and therefore the greater profitability from the development as a whole. Likewise, during the sell-down phase, at the point where the development is being sold off into the market, the developer may not opt to simply pay off the bank initially in full, but rather maintain some leverage ratio with the sold property, so that the property still on the developer's books maintains that maximum leverage ratio that the developer has negotiated. This means that the developer can actually start withdrawing equity earlier, and by removing equity early, they can realise a profit. Finally, Sales in development are referred to as realisation, and this particular piece of jargon is important for property economists to be aware of.